Hello, everyone, and welcome to Modern Poetry in Translation's online launch of Measureless Melodies, Focus on Vietnam, our wonderful issue, which is illustrated. The cover is illustrated by Tien Nguyen, and it shows Vietnamese plants and a woman in an ao dai resting on them, red against blue. My name is Khairani Barokka, and I am the editor of Modern Poetry and Translation. I'm an Indonesian woman with glasses and red lipstick, black and white cardigan on a gray sofa. I'm so incredibly excited and honored to introduce our lovely participants of this Zoom launch. Coming all the way from Vietnam, from Hanoi, is Hiền Trang, and Mỹ Ngọc coming in from Denver very early in the morning. Thank you so much. It's wonderful that both of you can make it from across the world. And thank you so much to Audrey, who is our excellent BSL interpreter today. So this is a really special event because we're going to be listening or watching signed Vietnamese poetry spanning centuries. So I'd like to start with Minh Ngọc because she translated a wonderful classical poet, Hoa Xuan Huang, who was born in the 1700s and has written incredible poetry. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Minh Ngọc and the poet that she has translated. So coming in from Denver, Mỹ Ngọc is a Generation 1.5 Vietnamese American living in Denver, Colorado. A writer, artist, and scholar, her works have appeared in The Guardian and Huffington Post. Ho Xuan Huang, I hope I'm saying that correctly, Mỹ Ngọc, lived from 1772 to 1822 in northern Vietnam during eras of political turmoil, either as a concubine or single woman with many lovers. There is no debate, however, regarding her central role in Vietnamese folk poetry and tradition. So without further ado, Mỹ Ngọc, we welcome you to this launch and we'd love to hear your poetry. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction. Hi again, my name is Mỹ Ngọc. I am a Vietnamese woman wearing a bright green áo dài, sitting with some shelves and some tapestries behind me. And I would like to first, before I go into reading the poems, introduce a bit more about how I found out about Ho Sung Hoong's poetry and came to translate them. I would never describe myself as a poet or a translator, but I found her poems a few years ago and was almost by accident. I can't remember how. I just remember finding them and then learning more about this legendary woman, and was very enthralled by how subtle and wise and also very playful all of her poems were. And reading the translations that were available, I enjoyed them, but I also felt like there was something missing. As someone who is always learning and speaking, learning and trying to speak the Vietnamese language better, because I moved to the US when I was very young, I've always been trying to reconnect with my language and my culture. And in that process, found more and more of a fascination with the Vietnamese language. So when I found Ho Sung Hoong's poetry, I started to study them more and then found that, oh, if I was translating them, I would do things a little bit differently. And so I started doing that, and some of these poems were what came out of that. And so I'd like to share with you 5 poems today that I felt really captured the breadth of her work. And the first one that I will start with is Sweet Rice Ball Afloat. And without further ado, here is the poem. My body is both white and round, rising, then sinking in these mountain waters. I'll rip apart despite men's molding hands. Nonetheless, my heart remains red and pure. So it's short and sweet, like a little sweet rice ball. And after each poem, I just wanted to describe a little bit more about it and the context, what it means. And so this poem, Sweet Rice Ball Afloat, is one of her most famous ones, and it became very famous when a Vietnamese singer during our times named Hoàng Thúy Linh made a music video with lyrics based on it, actually. So you can look up that song if you'd ever like. The song is basically about sweet rice balls, which are made with a very sweet filling. And the way that they're cooked is that they float when they're finished cooking. And so that last line, or the line rising, then sinking in these mountain waters, kind of shows the process of how they're cooked too. They'll rise and then they'll sink, and then eventually they'll just keep floating. And she's obviously relating her body to the rice balls. But I love this poem because it shows how it highlights the tender but enduring heart of Vietnamese women. And Ho Sung Hung lived in a very patriarchal, an extremely patriarchal moment in Vietnamese society at the end of the Lê dynasty, when Confucianism was starting to crack. But it was still very patriarchal. And so it's a critique of that society. And it just shows the just the essence of a Vietnamese woman's heart. So that's why I chose that poem. And I can read the next poem now. The next poem is called Gecko Cavern. Heaven and earth birthed this massive rock, split into two by a gaping crack. The damp opening bears moss without shame. A wind blows deeply through, making music. Sweet drops of water splash and splatter. The path leading in is beyond dark. Praise the hand that carved the stone, bared so indecently, one has to look. So pretty much all of Ho Sung Hung's poems are kind of a double entendre. And there are double entendres in different ways. Sometimes they're more subtle, sometimes they're focusing on a different thing. And Gecko Cavern, it has this playful eroticism weaved throughout, alongside this reverence for nature and its forms. And Gecko Cavern is located in the mountains in Hanoi. And funny enough, after I translated this poem, I started reading more about it and learned, maybe Hiền Trang can knows more about this history, but I learned that it's actually the site of a giant mass grave, where there's 3,600 skeletons or something buried in there in this giant tomb. And the history is that the generational knowledge is that over 2,000 years ago, during the anti-Han period of Vietnam, there was a general Lu, I don't actually know how the actual intonation, Lu Ya, but he guided, his army was being defeated, and so he led his army into the cave in retreat. But when the enemy found out, they blocked the entrance to the cave, and so they all died in there. So there's that history to the cave, and there's that history to the cave that people weren't aware of until recently, but since then it has become a place to pray for love, happiness, and richness. And I realized coming back that Ho Sung Hung was probably aware of this history, or maybe not, but just knowing that whether or not she was aware, and she wrote this poem about Gecko Cavern, shows an additional layer of meaning to this cave. where there's a reference for just this natural gaping crack. And who knows if that was where the boulders were actually put in place. So lots of things happening inside this one little cave. So the next poem I'll read is Lady in the Riverboat. And I chose this poem kind of in the middle because it's the only poem in this 5 that actually features explicitly a woman. And it's a war story, which is such a recurring theme in Vietnamese media. There's a wartime love story. And also there were so many wars that were occurring during Ho Sung Hoong's lifetime, because she lived to see through the Dae Sung Rebellion and years of civil war that came before the Nguyen dynasty. And so this lady, without further ado, I'm going to read the poem first and then describe it. So this is The Lady in the Riverboat. Spring has once more carried longing into the lady's heart who steers the riverboat. She drifts away to 3 springs past, his promise to return from another shore. But the lover from that ancient spring never came back again to her water's side. The river replaced itself again and again. Her paddles became worn, as did her heart. This year, spring comes a 3rd time. Karma's embers fade at last to ash. Can't bear the endless weight of waiting. So she casts away her lover's words, leaves her boat, her rowing, her river, to become at last another man's bride. And in the shadow of her absence, many passengers longing for their guide. So this poem has a very different emotional tone as you can listen. There's a thread of heartbreak and longing and grief throughout. Ho Sung Hoong was likely a Mahayana Buddhist, like many of the people in that time in Vietnam. And there are themes of Buddhism kind of woven throughout this poem, sometimes more explicitly, like karma's embers fading at last to ash. It shows like the connection that this lady in the riverboat had with her lover, and perhaps the karmic fate that they had together was only for a certain time. They didn't have what in Vietnamese we would say có duyên, or enough karmic connections to be together for longer than that. And there's also Buddhist themes of impermanence, of observing impermanence in the world, and the river replacing itself again and again. And so it's kind of like a setting of life within this backdrop of war, and then the much bigger cosmological backdrop of this impermanence, and of longing, longing for each other and for relationships with each other. And if you ever go to Vietnam or look at pictures, there's so many rivers, and so this is just very based on the landscape too. All right, so I'm going to transition into the 4th poem, which is also set in springtime. And it's called Spring Pagoda. Gentle evening, spring comes to the pagoda, lucid and light, unclouded by worldly sin. Temple bells ring 3 times, echoing waves. A puddle trembles, weaving water and heaven. Love's vast ocean could never grow shallow. Its graceful source reaches all distant shores. Now, where can bliss be found? Bliss is here, 9 times in 10. Okay, so again, we have some Buddhist themes weaving through. And this time, there's more of the aspect of compassion is really running through. What's happening in this poem is there's a sad little puddle near a pagoda, and then a raindrop is penetrating it or something. And looking at that puddle, Ho Sung Hoong just sees the interconnectedness of heaven and earth, and just this moment captures so much for her. It's a pure and simple setting of peace. And in a way, Ho Sung Hoong is returning, also critiquing the way Buddhism, this is my interpretation, might be critiquing how Buddhism and the operations of Buddhism are in that time, where it's an intent to return to just the practice and not so much of the rites and rituals that are often very pronounced in the wider culture. So yeah, I love this poem, and I dressed in spring colors to kind of match that today. And I'll move on to this last poem, which is also a seasonal poem, guiding us forward into the fall, because the poem is named Autumn Scene. And I'll start reading it. Banana leaves, pattered on by gentle rain. What gifted hands to paint such scenery. Ancient trees raise canopies wide and round. The river's surface lies still, glistening white. Drunk on hills, I sip my wine. My bag, moonlit, is heavy with poems. Look around you and you will find love. Having seen this, who cannot be stunned? So once again, we're looking at nature's beauty, and in a very different way. I wanted to end with this poem because Ho Sung Hoong brings herself into this poem. She was a very, very unique woman, and then unique feels like an understatement. She lived independently. After the lores, she was maybe married a couple times, was a concubine to both of her husbands, potentially, because during that era, it was the dowries for women were getting so expensive that a lot of noble class women were not getting married. They were getting sold as, or becoming concubines instead. But the point is that at the end of her life, Ho Sung Hoong, after her second husband died, lived by herself independently in her own home, which was very unheard of during that time. And she traveled. She traveled to many places, as evident in her poems being based in different locations. And I think, this poem came out of her travels. That bag, the moonlit bag that's heavy with poems, is actually back in those days carried by wandering poets to hold their samples of poetry. And back then she wrote in Nom, which is the Vietnamese, basically the Chinese script, but based on Vietnamese. And so these were written in scrolls that were kept in those bags. And so I can just see her sitting on a hill, and just her full essence as a woman, as a very loving human, and such a powerful poet comes through in this line. And so yeah, I will. Those are all the poems that I've prepared for today. So I just really want to thank you all for listening and being so attentive. and for appreciating this, the sound of her poetry with me.
Well, we thank you so much, Mỹ Ngọc, because that was an incredible reading, and thank you so much for contextualizing each poem and Ho Shun Hung's life so beautifully. Thank you so much. We had a question while you were reading about where to find these poems, and once again, they're all in Measureless Melodies, Focus on Vietnam, and you can go to our website and hear some of these poems being read, as well as read them online. I'd also like to thank, first and foremost, before I do anything else, the Arts Council England was an incredible supporter of MPT and allowed this issue to happen. So thank you to Arts Council England. And next we have Hiền Trang coming in from Hanoi. Thank you so much for joining us. It's evening where you are, quite late. I'll just quickly read Hiền Trang's bio. Hiền Trang is a Vietnamese novelist and essayist with 6 published books. A melomaniac. If you Google that, that means a lover of music. A melomaniac and a cinephile at heart. Her works explore the relationship between humans and the arts in a world where beauty is decaying. And in our Vietnam Focus issue, Hiền Trang contributed 2 poems that she self-translated. So poems that she originally wrote in Vietnamese and then translated herself into English. And she's going to read them and a few more for us today. So welcome, Hiền Trang. And thank you once again, Mỹ Ngọc.
Hello, everyone. First, I have to apologize for my not very fluent English. I never call myself a poet, and to be honest, I just started writing poems like less than 6 months ago. So I feel at the same time embarrassed and proud to have my poems present here next to Ho Xuân Hương, who is like one of the most respected writers in Vietnamese history. So I would just read my poems. And the first one is A Poet Shack. Would I keep writing poems if I were a shark? When I couldn't use poems as a trap to hunt? Would the world need a poet shark, an underwater boneless Homer, telling an epic from 450 million years ago about a swimming hero that long perished? It was be necessary in the unfathomable darkness of 100 feet below the sea, where readers were just shrimps and octopuses. Would it mean anything for anyone that there was a shark living rhythm, sensing not just its victims, but also a poem forever unpublished? An anonymous writer, writing for the sake of writing. No royalty, no recognition, no prize, no awards. Would the shark keep writing? I don't know. But if I were a shark, I would still write. So this poem comes from my real life because I earn for a living by writing, and I can write up to 2,000 and 3,000 words per day. And I always ask myself, what if I cannot earn money from writing? What if nobody reads my writing? Would I still keep writing? And sometimes I even feel that I have overexploited my writing ability. I write for publishing house, for newspaper, for magazines, for everyone that they are willing to pay me. So it's a true life of a writer. It's not a romantic life, not a dreamy life, but to be honest, a struggling life. And I wonder if one day I wake up and found myself having transformed into another kind of being, like Gregor Samsa turned into an insect, when writing would be no use to me. So will I keep writing? And a poet shark was born out of those questions. The second poem, Perfumed Ghost. My finger scents are yours, the cardamom ghost of your perfume, the Mer's ruin, the sandalwood vestige, the gagwood phantasm, the Ambrosian spirit. They possess everything my fingers pick: piano keyboard, lead balm, an old vinyl of Chopin's ballads played by Martha Argerich, a book by Umberto Eco about the history of beauty, a slice of pineapple pizza, a bar of white chocolate, a raindrop, room sweet tears, vagina discharge, a calico cat, a polka dot umbrella, a doorknob, a remote control, the handlebar for my motorcycle, a toothbrush, a tube of hydrocortisone, my hair, and the fingers of my Lord. Even the fingers of my Lord cannot exorcise your ghost. Even the fingers of my Lord come to take your sense. So this poem, I was tidying my room when I found a bottle of perfume that my ex-lover gave me on the last day when we were together. It was a bottle of perfume half used but wholly scented, and its fragrance lingers on my fingers even after I took a bath, and it feels as if I have been possessed by an aromatic spirit. And in Vietnamese folk beliefs, we have a concept of duyên âm, which is a romantic relationship with a dead person who might be your lover in a previous life. And the deceased hasn't been reborn, so he or she keeps following you and haunting you until the end of time. And Perfumy Ghost was born out of this memory. My third poem, and this is actually my very first poem. I never write poetry. Poetry is like the appendix, or in Vietnamese, ruột thừa, the redundant intestine, an organ without function. When it inflames, it causes pain and misery. I never write poetry. Poetry to me is like fried banana pies. I can devour them like Cronus devoured his kid. But is there anything they can leave other than pimples bursting on my face and my chest? I never write poetry. Poetry to me is like the invisible words Chomo Wan whispered into a hole in the ending scene of that sentimental, overrated movie of Wong Kar-wai's. He buried the newborn syllables in ancient Angkor Wat, not letting anyone, not his lover, not a Cambodian monk, take a glimpse of them. I never write poetry, but today, when you told me that I ate your heart, all I could think was, what can I say? In my country, people never express I love you. They just utter, the moon is so bright today. And here we are, on the beach at night alone, under a sky full of stars, but the moon was nowhere to be seen. A new moon day, what could I tell you? I can only write a moonless poem for you. So this poem is actually like a tribute to Natsume Soseki. He's a Japanese poet, and there was a story about a student who asked Soseki how to translate "I love you" into Japanese, and he said, the moon is so bright today." Somehow I think that the Japanese culture shares some similarities to Vietnamese culture. In Vietnam, we also never tell, I never tell my mother or my father that I love them. And at the same time, I also never tell my lover that I love him. I never say I love you. It is a very reserved culture. And I write this poem because of that. The fourth poem is inspired by an article that I read in a newspaper about a woman who came to a 5-star resort and she found a snake lying there. The snake in a 5-star resort. He was staring at me. Or was it she? He was slithering out of the bathtub, looking onto a tulip garden. I should have been lying there, soaking in hot water, putting my feet up, like the model in the brochure, happy and worry-free. Life is a journey, said the slogan engraved on the front page. It was written by me. The snake was staring straight. How did I look in his gaze? Did he serpentize my portrait, or did I humanize him? A dichromatic reptile. How could he see my scarlet moxie, my straw hat with its cherry ribbon? I was just a moving greenish yellow figure, something faceless, with neither wavy hair nor eyeliner, tattooed eyebrows nor striped lashes. I wish he could see my glossy lipstick and the studs on my nails. The snake was flickering its tongue. Was he also a summer vacation, taking leave from his jungly office? Was he just an amnesia patient, forgetting that this was no longer his nest, and I am Eve, coming back to paradise to expel him and his god? Should I scream? Should I run off? Perhaps he was a nostalgic killer, returning to the scene of a crime he once committed. Perhaps he was just someone waiting for the nostalgic killer to return. The snake was closing his eyes, lowering his tail. I didn't know he was giving his last breath. I felt a sanctuary to live in. He felt a tomb to die in. To him, maybe life was also a journey. And the last poem is a love poem, An Unlost Key. I still keep the key to our old room, a bone-white card, sometimes used as a bookmark while I was reading Octavio Paz, If We Are a Metaphor of the Universe. An unlost key to a lost place. The frames once hanging black and white portraits now only hang patches of void. The walls cemented with your crooning have been torn down into debris. Milky dust of files and grid of touches, floating in the air, stimulating a nostalgic sneeze. And in the early morning, some wheelbarrows came over, loading the remains for disposal. A history of amour vanished overnight, as though an asteroid had committed suicide by jumping to the ground from 100,000 feet height. Buddha said, in the universe, nothing is lost. Physicists said, total energy is conserved in time. But somehow, what's gone is gone. The key will be here with me for 1,000,000 years. Still, our love is a T-Rex, gigantic and extinct. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much, Hiền Trang. Thank you so much, Hiền Trang and Mỹ Ngọc. I'm actually going to go right to the questions because and I'll also ask some questions of my own in between. I just want to say, first of all, that there is a thread I see of whimsy and of independence and of a fiery spirit in both Ho Xuan Hong's poetry and Hiền Trang's poetry, spanning centuries, and that's really lovely to see. So we had a question about where to find these poems, and actually our wonderful digital editor, Ed Cottrell, if you look in the Q&A, he's just made the digital edition free to read online for the next 24 hours. So you can share that link with your family and friends as well. For the next 24 hours, they can read our whole Vietnamese issue. So Angela McGee asks, Mỹ Ngọc, thank you so much for your reading and your explanations, Mỹ Ngọc. Sorry I can't make the correct letters of your name. I would like to ask how easy or difficult you found it to connect to the Vietnamese language and how you did that. Did you travel to Vietnam, learn from relatives, or books, or some other way? And that actually connects to, in my list of questions, I wanted to ask you, Mỹ Ngọc, I saw on your website, you said that you learned Vietnamese through karaoke. And I would love for you to elaborate and answer Angela's question.
Yes, karaoke is part of the beginning. So I moved to the US when I was a baby. And so I learned Vietnamese. My first impressions of Vietnamese were through absorbing the sounds that I heard over the kitchen table. So I basically speak kitchen table Vietnamese. Like I know that. So I learned to speak it early on that way. And then I learned how to start reading it through karaoke. We love karaoke in Vietnamese culture, and there were these karaoke machines where you would they were preset with all these songs, and then they could broadcast into a screen, and there's like ocean scenes, like lots of different landscape scenes with like the words playing. So there would be like jellyfish, and then like these like lyrics playing at the bottom. And so that's how I started reading. And that's how it was for a while. My Vietnamese actually started fading away. But then I was very lucky that that my cousin and her mom moved to the US and lived with us. So in me teaching her English, she taught me Vietnamese too, because that's the only way we could communicate with each other. And that saved my Vietnamese, to be honest, because I was a teenager and losing it. And then oddly enough, after traveling for a bit in South America and learning Spanish, I came back and it was at like this different switch in my brain had turned on, and it became easier for me to reabsorb Vietnamese in a more sophisticated way, like understanding the grammatical structure and piecing things together. So as you can see, it was a very organic process, and I had never officially taken a class. I had traveled to Vietnam a couple times to visit family, and my Vietnamese improved so much. But really, it's like slowly gathering a book of poems here, a book of folk tales, and like a bilingual book of Vietnamese folk tales there. Lots of time on Google Translator, and also reckoning with like, but this doesn't make sense. So kind of like gathering external bits of knowledge and then grappling that with what I know the language feels like and sounds like. So it's a very personal process for me. And in translating these poems, it was easy and difficult at the same time. It was easy to know what felt right, but hard to find the right word. And I had to make a lot of decisions in terms of like what to sacrifice and what to hold on to. And I would say that I'm still there's so much more that I want to learn about Vietnamese language, but I don't want to rush this process, because I feel like this process of translation parallels with my own process of reconnection, and with things like that. You can't push the river. I just gotta let it sink in when I'm ready for it.
I
But
really love that sentiment. You can't push the river. My gosh, I'm gonna have it tattooed on my forehead. That's wonderful, Mỹ Ngọc. Thank you. And it also kind of explains, your self-description as a 1.5 generation Vietnamese American, and sort of the decimal point being a connection in some ways, between, where you come from and where you are now. That's wonderful. It kind of relates to Maria's question. These are amazing / beautiful / startling. What were the challenges for you as writers translating into English, especially given the cultural differences mentioned? So Hiền Trang, maybe you can speak about, the challenges of self-translation in particular, which, having done a little bit, it's almost you feel a certain pressure to accurately represent yourself, and which is separate from translating someone else perhaps. So could you speak to your challenges in terms of translating yourself?
So I have to translate myself because no translator translate my work. So that's the reason. But I found out that after I write the poems in Vietnamese and translate, actually I wouldn't say translation, but I will use adaptation, because something that worked in Vietnamese what work in English. I think so. So my method of work is, first I write in Vietnamese, then I translate it into English, and then I translate it again from English to Vietnamese. So it's like, yeah, because I found out that the dynamics of language helped me notice some weakness in my poems. There are things, yeah, that cannot be translated or cannot work in both language. I think so. So I have the way of, I don't know if it's special, but I think that it may work for self-translators because we have total control on our work.
Yeah, that's fascinating that you translate into English and then back into Vietnamese. I've never, really heard of that as a continual process, as a constant process for someone before, and that's really lovely. Shastravet says, so interesting hearing Mỹ Ngọc talking about how the Vietnamese language found her in gradual stages. Not a question really, but I found it so moving and also affirming to hear her talk about this process. Same. And Kexin Huang said, I think in response to Hiền Trang speaking of how you don't really say I love you in Vietnamese culture, Kexin says same in Chinese culture. So I'd also like to ask, I guess in terms of one more question for Hiền Trang is like, what drew you to poetry? Because you're a novelist, you have 6 books out, and you only started writing poetry, and it's incredible work, a few months ago, not even a year ago. So what caused this jump into poetry?
So I had been trying to keep my distance from poetry all of my life. I fear that this art of illusion, how can I say, it will reveal my weakness and fragility. Fragility. And it all happened in one night, one moonlit night. At that time, I was walking along the shore of the Michigan Lake in Chicago with a friend of mine. He's also a poet. And we came across an old delivery man. He's a very old man. He asked me if I know where to get some destination, and of course, I don't know. And we started talking a little bit, and there was a moment when this delivery man, he recited a poem of Barokka to us. He speak in Spanish. That poem was in Spanish, and it is like one of the last poem of Barokka. Is like his premonition of his own death, which happened a few weeks later. And at that moment, it was like there was a beautiful light shining over this old guy. For the first time, I felt like poetry is very different from novels. I think like when I write stories, I need big ideas. But for poetry, any ideas can become poetry. Poetry is everywhere. It can be in the tiniest corner of the world, and it gives me a fresher dimension of relationship between me and words, between me and literature. And when I write stories, I always feel an urge, like, how can I attract readers? I always ask myself if this attract readers. But with poetry, I don't have that feelings. I just write because I want to. And I never think like I have to write this to publish somewhere. Even if there's no reader, it's all right, it's fine. So that's how I come to poetry.
Oh, that's beautiful. And kind of relating to your poem, A Poet Shark, right? That you would keep writing even if there was no audience. And I will remember that image of the moon shining on this old guy reciting Lorca to you. This is such an incredible poetry origin story. So Polly Atkin asks in the Q&A that is such a fascinating model of adaptation or translation back and forth that Hiền Trang has described with adapting her own work. Would love to know, for both of you, how the process of translating might have changed your process and practice more widely. Mỹ Ngọc, would you like to answer that?
Sure. And I was actually really fascinated by your description, Hiền, of back translating your poems into Vietnamese. And I had actually heard of that method before, but in a very different context of research in terms, because I also do some research as a social work scholar. And sometimes in translating surveys, for example, to make sure that it's a valid translation, you will do just that, translate from English into a different language, and then translate that translated thing and back into English, and then compare those two versions to see if they match. So it's kind of an interesting exercise to see, like, is this valid with myself if you're translating your own poems? So for me, sorry, I just wanted to make that little comment, but for me, the process of translating, I based my translation process primarily on for his name, the Robert Bly Steps of Translation, which is I'll try to remember it as clearly as I can, but first it is literally translating the poem, and then re-editing that again and again in multiple iterative stages until it captures like the essence of the poem. And for me, the decisions I made when I was editing from the literal translation was like, with Ho Sung Hoong, she wrote in the Lu Xie style of poetry, which is basically like a sonnet in heptameter and usually like 8 lines. That's like the standard, and like lots more complicated rhyme schemes. But I noticed in the translations I was reading that they mostly didn't have a strong structural component to them, and I really wanted to be structural. So I made sure that each line would have 7 words. And it was really hard to make the end rhymes work. So I paid a lot of attention to sound within each line, because Vietnamese is such a melodical language. In fact, when the French missionaries first came, they first equated the language of Vietnamese to like the bird song. So I really paid a lot of attention to sound, and like, does this sound musical? And then, so sound was probably some of the first things I paid attention to. And then at the end, I was trying to see if I captured just the right amount of eroticism or in playfulness. But it's like just really trying to listen to the poem on a small level and at a big level at the same time, and being like, well, is what I'm writing actually capturing what I'm hearing from the original Vietnamese?
Yeah, if
And
I can quote, oh,
yeah,
sorry. If I can quote your own your own introduction to your translations and the issue, you said, for instance, she writes almost exclusively in heptameter, and while I could not translate lines into 7 syllables in English, I instead translated each line into 7 words. And I love that you sort of maintained a format based on this number 7. And you couldn't translate everything into 7 syllables like she did, but instead you transposed that into translating 7 words instead. I think that's kind of a beautiful a beautiful technique that like pays homage to her heptameter. So yeah, sorry to interrupt. Just wanted to admire your technique.
oh, thank you. That was pretty much it.
Um, so I think I think that there's kind of a kind of a fierce femininity in both of your work, right? In Hiền Trang's work and also in Ho Xuan Heng's. Please correct me, by the way, if I'm mispronouncing. Ho Xuan Heng, is that?
It is close. Oh, Sun Hương.
Oh, Xuan Heng.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay. Thank you. And because of the melodic nature of the Vietnamese language, and because it's so tonal, I wonder if you think that there's so many poems in this issue, first of all, that deal with interiorities and femininities. And I wonder if you both think that there's like an inherent ease with femininities in the Vietnamese language. Please tell me if I'm completely off base, but it's just like there's so much. If you read your poems and other poems in this issue, there's so much. It's almost like creating dreamscapes and songs with each poem that is so beautiful and to me evokes femininity. But I wonder what you think and if I am completely off base.
So to be honest, when I was a small kid, I never think of being a writer because every author that I have to learn in textbook, like 95% of them are men. And I never think that writer is an occupation for women. But you are right that the Vietnamese language is a very melodic language, and somehow it's a very loose language. Like the grammar in the Vietnamese grammar is not as strict as English, and if you use strict grammar, it will sound very funny. So somehow it has the flexibility. Like I would describe the Vietnamese language like the water. So I think somehow its flexibility is like a human. Um, and and actually, I never think of myself. I rarely think about myself as a woman, to be honest. But I think like when I reread my poems, you are right. They are very feminine, which is something that people will not find in my novels. So it is something I think very fascinating to me that when I write poems, I'm more feminine.
That's very interesting. Yeah, and what you said about the Vietnamese language is like water. It's like in Ho Shan Hung's poem that you translated, Mỹ Ngọc, like weaving water and heaven. Which is such a memorable line. And I thought about it a lot when I was editing uh the issue because it really is kind of like a river that you can't push. To quote you again, I'm basically just quoting you both endlessly over and over again. But yeah, thank you, and that is fascinating, and I'm glad that you're finding another side of yourself in the poetry, Hiền Trang. So we have only a few minutes left. Is there anything else that you would like to say about maybe like hearing each other's work, or what you would like to convey about the work that you've done in closing? Maybe Mingo?
Yeah, I will just say that this was a very for me, a very magical experience. Like you said in the beginning, Alka, this poetry spans like so many centuries. And just the connection of what you were just talking about, the femininity, like, and strength that comes across in these poems is really strong, and not even a connection that I would have necessarily made. But it's cool to note that kind of like that enduring legacy of how the language can show up and like reveal in poetry so much resistance. Yeah, that's the word that's coming up to mind, is resistance.
Resistance to what, if I may ask? You want to elaborate?
I'm just thinking of like resistance to boxes, resistance to being defined by other people or being told what to do. And or what you should be doing. I mean, for me, this process of learning Vietnamese and even translating poems is nothing I should be doing. But it's just this like calling or this longing to do it. And I feel like that kind of in the way the Vietnamese language, it's just so beautiful, and it's cool to see it manifesting through like poetry. So
I think it's what you should be doing. Absolutely. And thank you for doing it. Kate writes, thank you so much for this wonderful hour. Beautiful words, both in poetry and the Q&A. I am floating. Thank you. So well, Kate. So do you have any closing words, Hiền Trang?
I just want to say my thank you. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to read poems to everyone. I never think that I would write poem, and I never think that I would be here and read my poems for you guys. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I want to say that I think it's very special for me as an Indonesian person as well to work with Vietnamese artists and writers. I think there's like a solidarity, a Southeast Asian solidarity. And I've always loved going to Vietnam and experiencing the incredible poetry that comes out of it. And I think that I just really wanted to make a focus on Vietnam issue because all this poetry coming out of Vietnam and written in Vietnamese was just blowing my mind. And I'm so grateful that both of you are here and have shared so much of your work. And I think the audience is very grateful as well. Thank you from Shastravet, and Richard Price says, thank you so much for sharing your excellent work. Shash says, so lovely to hear this conversation and to hear the readings. So this was very wonderful for us as well. Thank you once again to Arts Council England. If you would like to subscribe to Modern Poetry and Translation, we have individual subscriptions and institutional subscriptions. So if you work for a university or a library and you would like them to subscribe to MPT, they can do a free trial of the institutional subscription. And that's a good way to get your work out as well if you would like it to be available to anyone associated with an institution. And you can also subscribe as an individual. And on our website, for every issue, we have recordings, including Mỹ Ngọc contributed, and Hiền Trang also contributed audio of some of their work, along with about 4 other poems from different poets are up on the website with audio, and there's a lot more for you to explore on the website and in print. So thank you both once again. Thank you so much, Mỹ Ngọc and Hiền Trang, and to the spirit of Ho Shan Hung, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but to the spirit of Ho Shan Hung, you're getting lots of thanks and admiration in the chat. So thank you both, and thank you to Audrey for translating into British Sign Language. Have a lovely day, and thank you so much once again.